What's up guys, it's Zane. Today I wanted to bring you guys a video describing the basics of counter-economics, how to distinguish between different types of markets, and some further considerations on the concept of counter-econ. First, let's start by defining counter-economics. Counter-economics can be described as both a means of achieving a libertarian society, a form of peaceful protest, a means of self-liberation, and as libertarianism in practice. It is a theory created by Samuel Edward Konkin III as a means and practice of agorism in attempts to achieve the agora. Counter-economics is the practice of operating in non-violent markets outside of the state's sanction. For example, collecting rainwater in a state where that is deemed illegal would be considered counter-economic. Let us begin by outlining the different types of markets. First and foremost, the most prominent type of market is the white market. This compiles all state-ordained legal actions that do not violate the non-aggression principle, things like going to Walmart, Amazon, etc. Next, we have gray markets. Gray markets are things that are deemed legal by the state, but the transaction takes place outside of the state's sanction. Say I buy a computer off of Craigslist and don't pay the sales tax on it. Or I live in a state where weed consumption is legal, but I still don't buy it through a state vendor. This could be considered black market still if the private sale of these goods is deemed illegal. Having a home garden where you grow your own crops is gray market. Another example would be purchasing legal guns through a private vendor rather than a federally licensed dealer. Next, we have black markets. These are goods and actions deemed illegal by the state that are not in violation of the non-aggression principle. Take, for example, purchasing drugs, speeding on the highway, illegal fabrication and sales of firearms, etc. Another example of a gray/black market transaction, depending on how it's framed, would be, say, hiring your neighbor's kid to mow your lawn, or paying your employees under the table, just for a few more examples. Counter-economists try to maximize their gray and black market transactions and limit their white market ones. There are two other more obscure markets, the red and the pink. Red markets are violent actions deemed illegal by the state, take for example murder or hiring a hitman. Pink markets are violent actions deemed legal by the state, take for example patents or intellectual property, things of this nature. Now that we've defined our terms, I want to bring up some further considerations to think about when discussing counter-economics. I've talked about these already a little bit in my blog post, A Brief Note on Counter-Economics, which I will link in the description of this video. Konkin outlines a formula that you can use to assess the risks to determine whether you should or should not go on a certain counter-economic action. Essentially, benefits must outweigh the risks. While I think this formula may be good for basic counter-economic actions, I think there needs to be room for more, quote, advanced counter-economics. While I think this formula may be good for basic counter-economic actions, I think there needs to be room for more advanced counter-economics, so to say. Thus, I would like to highlight a flaw I see in the formula, that being there's no time dimension. Now, counter-economics is both positive and normative. I'm not saying it's a moral science, but more of, say, in the Kantian tradition, a hypothetical imperative. If we want to be consistent libertarians and to achieve a libertarian society, we should do these things. Thus, I would like to propose some different outlooks on counter-economics. Konkin is not an absolutist in that he does not say that you can never participate in non-counter-economic markets, just that they should be maximally avoided. However, would still say that he is very monistic and that he gives a simple formula, either go or don't go on a counter-economic action based on this formula. The problem with this is that I think it is a naive or simplistic view. Is there room for pluralistic counter-econ? How about utilitarian counter-econ, etc., etc.? I think there are many problems with utilitarianism in general, so I won't be looking at it through this lens, but I would like to outline what I'd like to call pluralistic counter-economics. I'm not outlining a moral theory here, rather I'm using the scope of normative ethics to draw a parallel to counter-economics and understanding what we should and shouldn't do to achieve a libertarian society. The basic example I like to give is investment. Investment in a counter-economic world is very difficult, and everybody here is trying to secure a livelihood for ourselves. We all want to be able to live comfortably and retire at some point or provide for our kids, etc., etc. Whatever economic goals we have to achieve these by some sort of investment. We must delay consumption for a future date. So I will outline a few options for investing. First, we have your standard white market investments. You have investing in stocks, bonds, real estate. These are anti-counter-econ in a double sense. First, they are within the state sanction, and second, they often support, in the case of stocks, large corporations that are members of the political class, i.e. extended wings of the government. Take, for example, Amazon, who uses the government's monopoly on force to secure regulations and subsidy. But they're also a great investment vehicle. The next options we would have would be to start our own business. The problem here lies in that if we want to have a business that is lucrative, it likely needs to be above board. Having a business that you keep completely gray or black market will likely be either rather dangerous or you have to keep the venture small, so as a source of side income, as well as a means of a political statement. This is not entirely out of line with counter-econ, as Konkin does not state all of your income has to be tax-free, just that not reporting some of it alone is counter-economic. There are cryptocurrencies, which many people view as gray market currencies, but as of now, they aren't really currencies in the Austrian sense, since they are not widely accepted as mediums of exchange, and they aren't really gray market, as they are taxed by the state as an asset. Now, of course, if you evade these taxes or your capital gains on crypto, this would then be gray or black market, but that's a discussion for a later time. Also, if we want to use these as currencies in the future, we would hope to stabilize the value of the coin so that they become commonly accepted mediums of exchange. So it's probably not best to just use them as investment vehicles, or rather, as they are now, gambling vehicles. So that leaves us with the white market. Say I invest $100 a month in the stock market, have an average rate of return of 9% over 40 years, and I plan to spend this money after it's accrued and spreading liberty and counter-economic actions. That's $450,000 as opposed to $52,800 if the money was just saved. Some may mention precious metals, but these are also mostly white market, unless of course we don't pay the capital gains taxes, which applies to pretty much all of these. My point being, is there a threshold? What if I invest in order to spend that money later on counter-economic actions? Instead of $50,000 in counter-econ, there could be $450,000. Or even if I only spent half of that on counter-economic exchanges, it's still quadruple the amount of it. If it's just saved or consumed over time. This segues into my next point brought up in a post over on the Center for a Stateless Society about the existence of white market counter-econ, which I will link down below. They argue, and I agree with, that all actions that run counter to state power structures, even within the state, can be considered to have a degree of counter-economic nature to them. Take, for example, the Mises Institute. It is a federally registered nonprofit, but they are probably the #1 think tank for spreading anarchist and free market thought in the country. Thus, they are furthering the reach of the ideas of liberty by a great margin. So I think this can be considered to be counter-economic to a degree. What if I put my money in a Roth IRA, meaning I pay taxes on it now and don't pay taxes on the money in the future? Assuming you would be in a higher income bracket when you retire, your total tax burden is less than it would have been had you just invested in a standard brokerage account. While this is totally white market, I think any sort of counter-state action, such as lowering tax burden, is counter-economic to a degree. Another example would be donating to a nonprofit, which you could write off in taxes. Not only are you supporting an entity that is likely counter-economic in its own right, for example, they are able to provide some sort of service without paying taxes by not accruing a profit, and they could be counter-economic in another sense, like the Mises Institute, but you are also lowering your tax burden even if it's through the state tax code. Another example would be collection of rainwater in a state where it's totally legal to do so. This would be both conceived of as white or gray market, in my opinion, as I think the lines can honestly be quite blurry sometimes. But take, for example, the state of Florida, where you can actually get tax write-offs for doing this. Even though it is white market, you're still reducing your tax burden, and you are also decreasing tax burden in a more indirect way as well. If I'm collecting rainwater by myself, that's less money going to a water bill or purchasing water at the store, meaning less sales tax and less income tax for the businesses that I would have been purchasing the water from, etc., etc. So I think that we can think of our actions as being counter-economic in a much more broad sense than outlined by Konkin. I would also like to outline the concept of that an action can be partially counter-economic. For example, I purchased drugs from some friend of mine, but I used state-issued currency. The drug purchase part of the transaction is counter-economic, but the using a state-issued currency is not. Again, this is not to say that Konkin had nothing to say with these things, or that they even run totally counter to his ideas. I just want to give people some more perspective and more to think about in regards to counter-econ and spreading liberty. There are many more points I would like to make about counter-economics, but I will have to save those for future videos, as I don't want this one to run too long. However, if you have any questions or considerations of your own, please feel free to leave a comment, and if you enjoyed the video, please drop a like. As always, I'll see you guys later.